What's your emergency?
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the PIO Podcast, a place for all things public information related for police, fire, EMS, local, state, and federal government. An open forum to learn, grow, and develop your public information skills. My name is Robert Tornabene, and I am your host. I am a public information officer with over 17 years in the field and 27 years of law enforcement background. In each episode, we will explore different aspects of the public information officer profession. Weekly, we'll delve into the field of public information by talking to other PIOs. Welcome to Season 5. Thank you for your support of the podcast. I can't believe we're in our 5th season. So sit back and enjoy this episode.
Today on the PIO Podcast, we'd like to introduce Hollie Stark, Outreach Program Manager with the Washington State Emergency Management Division. Welcome to the show, Hollie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Awesome. Hollie, thank you for being here today. First, I'd like our listeners to know a little bit about you. And so could you tell us your background, and don't be shy about it, please?
Sure. I'll give you the long version that most people don't get. So in my private life, I'm a single mother of 3 children, and they're the loves of my life, my bestest buddies. They're all teenagers, so that's fun. And
Wow.
I'm a 6-time marathon finisher, which is more than some and less than a lot of people that I know, so somewhere in there.
6 times, wow.
Yeah, I love to run, and it's like my meditation, so the way I relax. And it's probably cliche, but I call myself sort of a jack of all trades and a master of none, which we've heard before, but I mean that in the respect that when I was in my formative years, I really, really struggled to know what I wanted to be when I was an adult. I think that I was very sure that I was going to be a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, a travel agent, and a dancer. Those are things I definitely recall. But when I was in first grade, I wrote this poem, and it was about the Statue of Liberty and all of the things that I thought she could see from her high vantage point. And I described them vividly, and I'd never been to New York City, but I was certain that these are things she could see. And it won my school's reflection contest for my age group. And I was hooked on writing ever since then. I never stopped writing. So I did pursue an English degree, which I thought was going to be useless. But even before that, I had started writing as a freelancer, doing, CD reviews in print and camping guides. I grew up in the desert Southwest, and so I camped and was outside all the time, and getting published. And then when I lived in California, I became a permanent part of a small, hyper-local paper called the Glendora Patch. The Patch was sort of they were experimenting with these hyper-local newspapers, telling the news of these small towns.
I remember the Patch when it originally came out. Yep.
Yeah, so I was there in Glendora, California, and it's kind of where I honed my AP skills and learned how to talk to public figures and cover parades. And then eventually I got a job in my hometown of St. George, Utah, at the St. George News, which at the time was sort of a small digital newspaper. I think they had 20,000 Facebook fans and were growing. And I stayed there for 7 years through a lot of growth. And then in 2020, which as you might recall was COVID and an election year, and I was going through a personal sea change, and I was getting a divorce and looking for a big change. My field, the field that I loved, was very scary. It was scary for me as a journalist. It was hard to earn the public's trust. I was like, I got to do something new. And through a series of very, very fortunate events, I landed a job in Hawaii at the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency.
Whoa, that's a big change.
Yeah.
Going from Utah to Hawaii?
Yeah, right. Southern Utah desert to Hawaii. And I got a job in external affairs, which I really didn't know anything about. But I fell in love with the field of emergency management and my role as a public information officer. And then from there, I am here now in the Pacific Northwest as the Outreach Program Manager. And so my job really focuses on those, what we call the 95%, or those blue sky days, what we do before an incident or a disaster occurs. But my response role in our emergency operations center is also as a PIO, or external affairs support.
Okay. So as a former journalist, what was the transition like? You go from working in, newspapers and online journalism. What was the transition on the other side of the microphone like?
Well, fortunately, like I said, the place where I worked was kind of growing. And as we grew, we merged with a media company, and it had an in-house video production company, as well as we operated 7 radio stations. So I had the real opportunity to expand my portfolio while I was primarily a reporter and a writer. I also got to do a lot of on-camera interviewing, a lot of video series, and I even recorded commercials, as well as did some voice tracking for radio. So that transition in that respect, from microphone to microphone, the only real difference was that now I'm answering the questions instead of asking them. And I think journalism was such a good empathy builder, right? Because I understand deadlines. I have a really good knowledge of what makes a good story. And so that was very helpful. So I don't think the transition was too hard, except for maybe I work for an agency now, right? And so I have to make sure that my messaging is very clear and concise, and it aligns with what our message wants to be.
When you first started as a PIO, did you have any challenges that you ran into?
Yes. Okay. So I started, like we said, in the middle of COVID, and the first sort of role they gave me to get my feet wet, which I'm never going to forgive them for, I had to answer all the phone calls and the emails of people who had been placed in quarantine for not following the safe travels protocols. So either they didn't get the right COVID test, or they didn't fill out the forms right. They get to Hawaii, they're ready for their vacation, and instead they're stuck in a hotel. And those calls all came to me. So that was a challenge in and of itself, but also entering this world that I work in with jargon and acronyms and a whole new language, while at the same time trying to absorb all that, I also had to communicate it to the public and present myself as an expert. And I think that was pretty challenging.
My daughter was in Hawaii in February of 2020. She had a friend that was on, her father was in the Navy. So he was on the naval base there, and she was visiting. So she was there for the early part of February, or no, maybe it was early March, because it was just before they went down to full lockdown, where they said you had to have travel documents and all that other stuff. And she's like, okay, I think I got to come home. And it was funny. She said, I got on a plane. There was nobody on the plane coming back. And then she sat in LAX for 8 hours waiting for her connector.
Yeah, what a wild
put over her
time.
head, mask on her face, nothing to do. It's just crazy times. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, the only good thing I can say about that is if you were willing to do the safe travels, which was kind of an ever-changing, sort of the mark was always being moved process. But if you were willing to do that, flights were cheap. It was easy to get around Hawaii, and you could see some of the land healing, which was beautiful. But yeah, it was a rough time. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think there was just so many unknowns and it was such a unfolding time of information and cross information and misinformation, and it was very hard to make heads or tails of things as it unfolded. And of course, hindsight's 2020. Everybody learned a lot more from that than they did at the time. But it is what it is. It just was an experience. That's the only way I could look at it. All right. So one of the reasons I wanted to get you on the show, Hollie, was because of your storytelling abilities, the skills that you developed working in the newspaper and working behind the mic, doing videos and things. I think storytelling is really underutilized skill for PIOs. And why do you think storytelling is so important for PIOs to utilize?
So, and then we touched on this a little bit in my introduction. It's in the world I work in emergency management, but you can see it across the fields where PIOs are needed. I feel like a lot of the focus and the public perception of what we do comes when we have these events already occurring. So the big, for lack of a better word, splashy things that we see on TV while an incident is occurring and the aftermath. And my very, very humble opinion is that we really need to start front loading that to the things we can do to prepare for these things before they come, and the protective measures that we can take so that they don't become such big of a disaster. And it's difficult, but I feel like that's where storytelling can come in. Like, for instance, we can use it to communicate risk, right? So here in Washington, we have, I don't know if you've heard of it, but we have what we call the Cascadia subduction zone, which is a subduction zone fault line that lies outside our coast, and it runs from the top of British Columbia, Canada, all the way down, or the bottom, all the way down to the top of California. It's about 750 miles long, and it's capable of producing a 9.0 magnitude earthquake and subsequent tsunami, right? But this hasn't happened since 1700, so it's not a very visible threat. But
except it's probably due.
Right. So exactly what you're saying. People don't see it. They haven't seen it. But we have these stories from our Pacific Northwest tribal partners that exist that talk about what we call the thunderbird and whale. And there's a few versions of it, but the thunderbird who lives in the sky and the whale who lives in the ocean. And before I continue this story, I just want to make it very, very clear. These are not my stories. I have the highest respect for our tribal partners. And the reason is because these stories tell of this big fight between the thunderbird and whale. And when they would fight, the trees would uproot and they would never grow again. And the earth would tremble and the ocean would recede and then come back and flood. And we didn't discover the Cascadia subduction zone until about the 1980s, when we finally figured out where this orphan tsunami in Japan came from and where these ghost forests here in Washington came from. And now we're thinking, ethnologists believe that maybe some of these stories were telling about this Cascadia subduction zone rupture. And now they told the story of this place in this time, and we can use it for our people in this time to say, look, it has happened in the past. These stories exist. It will happen again, and we have to get prepared.
Good, excellent point. And, I like the idea of storytelling because there's so many different ways you can do it. You can do it in short little bits and create a really frenzy about something if you're building towards an end, or it can just be that you're doing the educational thing like they do on TikTok, where they put they're putting multiple things out at a time, and it's episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, and it draws you back to that event and that account. But I wanted to talk about how does it build trust and empathy in a community?
This is such a great question. I mean, there's a lot of scientific research about it, but I'm just going to do it anecdotally or through storytelling. If you look at a community and you really drill down into the demographics, and we can really see this very clearly in the nation today, where we have very divided opinions, and they're very easy to express in the multiple platforms that we have, that our communities might be really different. And if you're lucky enough to live in a very diverse community, you will see different races, different primary languages being spoken, different age groups represented. Or maybe you live in a community where you have one age group that is kind of dominant in one color. But we see all these differences. And what I really try to focus on when we're trying to build empathy is the things that make us the same. We're all human. We all care about someone or something, and we all want to protect that. So when we use storytelling, we can use it in 2 different ways. And I use it when I tell a story. So if I am going to talk to a community and I'm trying to get them to make a plan for their family or for their household, I tell them the story of my own family. I'm a single mother. I have 3 children. They go to different schools. They have different sports and friend groups. And so at any given time in the day, we can be at 4 different places. And if something were to happen, my mama bear heart would be like, oh my goodness, where are my kids? How do I get to them? How do I communicate with them? And how do we all get back to each other? And I feel like a lot of people can empathize with that, right? They can picture themselves in a situation where they're separated from their loved ones, separated from their pets. And it really helps them think, oh, I could be in that situation and I need to figure out what we would do. The other way is by listening to stories. So when I went to Hawaii, I really didn't understand the native Hawaiian culture or the land. I only had like a tourist perspective, right? Oh, it's beautiful and the food is good and I can lay out on the beach. And I really thought, hey, I can go into these communities with my fancy brochures and my brand new jargon language, and they're going to listen to me. And it's so wrong, right? What I really discovered is that they built empathy in me by telling me their stories and their history and understanding their own vulnerabilities with this beautiful but very vulnerable island chain. And so we can do it by telling the story, but also by listening to these stories.
And now, a word from our sponsors. Increase your social media reach and streamline your workflow with Social News Desk, the social media management software trusted by government agencies across the country. Publish effortlessly and securely across multiple social networks, including Nextdoor. Stay connected with social listening, engagement, and reporting tools all in one place. And here's an exclusive offer just for PIO Podcast listeners. Get 3 months free when you sign up. Head over to socialnewsdesk.com/PIO to get started today. And now, back to our episode.
Okay, so going into this, as you've said, storytelling has been said to increase retention. What do you think about that? How does that increase retention? How does hearing a story get people to remember those important things that you want them to know?
Okay, so we're going to answer this question, but I'm going to have you do a little exercise with me first. So you don't need to close your eyes or anything, but think back to the first time you remember hearing a story that made an impact on you as a kid. And what was it?
It was my father. Many years ago, he was in the Marines, and he was stationed on the West Coast, and he had a friend that was a cook that had a Corvette. And my father used to leave the base in the Corvette, go drive around town, find the local police, and then speed away. And then because the guards at the gate knew the chef's Corvette, they would just let him drive through. And of course, the police couldn't go onto the base. So he would do that literally every weekend. And it was one of those stories that just sticks with me. Red Corvette, just the whole story. And then hearing about the chef getting stopped by the police weeks later was even funnier.
So it made an emotional impact on you. And then when we think back to like the stories that we heard as kids, maybe in school, they're teaching us things like the alphabet. When I asked my now 16-year-old son, what stories did I read to you that made an impact? And he said, oh, that freaking caterpillar book. And that's the Very Hungry Caterpillar, right? They're using these stories to teach us things like the alphabet, how to count, how to name and label things. And the reason it works in our brains is because we recognize a storytelling pattern. There is a beginning, there is a problem that needs to be solved, there's a resolution to that, and then there's an ending. And we can connect to that because stories follow this pattern, and that also helps build retention.
Okay. So how does it actually change people's behavior?
Well, that's the kicker, isn't it? We want our stories to change behavior, and I believe that they can, but we have to follow a few set of rules, and I have some notes because I want to do this exactly correct. First, we have to know our audience. So we talked about demographics, right? We have to know who we're telling this story to. It could be a TikTok audience, which is very different from a Facebook audience. You're doing a podcast right now. That's very different from a news broadcast or something like that. And we actually learned a lot about that this last election cycle, right? Where you're going to tell your story made a huge impact on who was going to go out and vote. Same thing here. You have to know who you're telling your story to. And then you have to choose your platform. We can choose to tell stories in 30-second snippets, and people are so good at it, and it's super engaging and very useful for the audiences that we have today with short attention spans and information overload. I could write a very long form journalistic story, which is my favorite way to write. I am in love with National Geographic and Outside Magazine and how they tell these long stories, but it doesn't work for every audience.
Right. Oh, you're right.
Yeah. And we have to be really, really clear about the behavior we want to change. What are we asking them to do, and do they understand that? Because otherwise, nobody's going to do anything, right? We're not going to take any action if we didn't understand the point of the story. What's the moral? What's the call to action that we're asking them to do?
Okay. Do you have any anecdotes that would highlight how people's behavior has changed?
I do. And I think that where we can see this the most, like very visually, is at the legislative level, right? In Hawaii, I had the really great opportunity to also act as the legislative liaison for the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. And so I got to be involved in every facet of kind of creating a bill and sending it to the legislature and then writing testimony. And in your testimony, you can get up and you can be like, well, we think this bill is good, and here are the facts, and 50% increase of whatever. But that doesn't necessarily translate to the legislature going, oh, I can see why this is important. So here at Washington Emergency Management, we also operate the Emergency Communications 911 State Coordination Center, and they have seen that the way to get the legislature to move is to have these 911 dispatchers come and testify to the power of their jobs. And they've talked about delivering babies, on a ferry through a phone call, and these life-saving measures that this really vital role does. And that's how we get funding for them and training for them. That moves people. And on our level, it's harder to quantify if we're making a difference. I can go to a tabling event and see 4,000 people, hand them all my brochures, and tell them all these amazing stories. But I can't quite follow them home to see if they're packing a go kit or making it. So I'm working harder. I'm trying to be more consistent in my messaging and tell better stories that really resonate with people. And I know that it can. I have firm belief that it can, but I'm still working harder to do it.
Oh, absolutely. And the most interesting thing that I found, what resonated with me about just having a go kit was way before COVID and before. It was actually just slightly before 9/11. There was a pretty severe storm, and in the Chicagoland area, we were snowed in for a couple days, and it became, wait, did we have enough food in the house? And luckily, it was just the two of us. It wasn't that much that we needed. But if I had kids, we may not have had enough. So I got into this thought process, okay, I'm going to make sure I stock up on supplies, things that are non-perishable, that aren't going to go away. But then I started planning for sicknesses and illnesses and making sure that I have proper medicine. And then, I had a friend that went through a wildfire out in, where was he at the time? He was in Colorado, and he went through a wildfire. He lost everything. He had just moved there. Everything was still in boxes. He hadn't unloaded everything. So I was thinking, man, where are all of our documents at? Do I know so I created something that was a grab and go. It's in a safe, but it's all set and ready to go. I can just go in there and pull it out and take it with. And then I have everything that identifies who we are in the event that we lost our IDs and all that other fun stuff. And that became like the onus for a lot of the things that I did with my kids later on. Like you were talking about what happens when your three kids are all way doing different things. I have three in their 20s, and we went to a concert 2 years ago. It was a Rolling Stones concert, and it's a big concert and lots of people. And I said to the kids, I said, listen, something will probably happen. We're going to get divided. Where are we meeting? And there was a statue outside of the stadium, and I said, this is our rally point. If anything happens, we get separated. We come here. We meet here. Because who knows if your cell phone's going to work? Who knows if you're going to have connectivity? Or what if you lose your cell phone? At least you know this is where we're going to be and we'll meet everybody. And that's kind of the way it's always been. I was a cop for years. My law enforcement background is one of those things that's always influenced that. So like my kids knew at a restaurant, I sat with my back I was facing the door. I always knew where the exits were at. I was always telling my kids, there's exits over there. If we got to go, that's the way we're going. All of that stuff. So I was always thinking that way.
Yep. I totally the same, except for not from a law enforcement perspective. But now my kids will go into a room and be like, okay, where would we go if there was an earthquake? What could fall on us? Or if we're at the coast, hey, if there's a tsunami coming, where's the nearest high ground? And I've taken my son to tabling events with me, and we have this banner, and he's so into the world that I work in. He's like, Mom, this probably isn't colorblind friendly, and you ought to think about redesigning this so that people can see what you're trying to say. And I'm like, I've taught them well.
That's a pretty good idea. I mean, what percentage of the population is colorblind? I don't even know, but that's got to be a decent percentage.
It is. And so that focus on that equitable distribution, and I'm actually going to talk about that later of how the stories are told and the visuals. And
So, Hollie, at the time when we are at an all-time low for public trust, there was a group of gentlemen that did a study about public trust. They're in their second year of study of this on the East Coast, and they found that public trust in government is at its all-time low. And public affairs people that work for those organizations believe that they're well trusted. And the reality of it is most of them are not. It's the local level PIOs that are fairly well trusted. How do you think that storytelling can help improve trust and build those relationships?
Well, I think we have to use our storytelling in a few different ways. And the first is that our stories, as wonderful as they may be, they have to be consistent, right? We can tell our stories, but the message and the actions that we want them to take have to be consistent across the board. And that builds trust, right? If you're hearing it over and over again, the message is the same. It's not confusing the public. We tell a story about a young woman named Tilly Smith. And this is as we approach the 20th anniversary of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. She was vacationing with her family in Thailand, and she had literally just learned about tsunamis in her classroom. She was 10 years old at the time. And she was on the beach and told her parents, she saw the ocean acting funny. You need to listen to me. We need to go. And she stuck to her guns and convinced her parents, and they were able to evacuate at least 100 people off of that beach, and all of their lives were saved when the tsunami came because she had heard this story and learned and then repeated this story. The message was the same.
This is the Mako Beach? This girl was at Mako Beach?
Yeah, I believe that is.
Okay.
So that message is very consistent, right? You see the ocean receding from the shore. You need to get to high ground. We tell that. These are the natural warning signs of a tsunami coming. And the more we say that, the more consistent it is. Then people aren't like maybe in the 1940s when the Scotch Cap Lighthouse in Alaska sent a tsunami all the way to Hawaii in Hilo. When the ocean receded, people went out and tried to gather the fish, and a lot of people lost their lives that day. But no, we don't want that to happen anymore. So the more consistent our storytelling can be, the better it is. And then the other thing is we have to use our stories to tell the truth, right? We can't sugarcoat anything. We believe that you can survive these big catastrophic events, or even a 4-hour power outage in the cold, or being stuck on the freeway for 3 years, but you have to get prepared. But we have to truthfully express the risk. So in Washington State, we have the second highest earthquake risk in the nation after California. We have 5 active volcanoes and 3,000 miles of shoreline that are all at risk of tsunami. We have to tell people that. They have to know, so that then they can take the proper actions to survive. And so that's the truth.
Hollie, wait a minute. I did not realize you guys are the second highest for earthquakes in the country?
Yeah, in the country. So Alaska gets more earthquakes than us. It's very seismically active, but they don't have the population and infrastructure that we do. And so risk is measured by the amount of people and bridges and
Okay.
roads and buildings that it can impact. So,
and you guys have an active a volcano go off. I mean, with Mount St. Helens many years ago, and
right.
I mean,
right.
I remember that, and that alone is scary enough. I mean, I could not even imagine. My son right now, he's stationed in San Diego, and I worry about him all the time with tsunamis and earthquakes and all that other fun stuff that could potentially happen. So yeah, I worry about it, but I'm not there. But I tell him, "Are you ready to go? Are you prepared?"
Yep. And if we just keep telling these stories consistently, more people will be ready. And the idea is that we really want it to be a grassroots neighborhood effort, neighbors helping neighbors, neighbors being resilient together, because I can't reach all 8 million people in the state by myself, even if my story was the most powerful ever. And so people have to tell their stories. You have to go out and be like, I learned from 9/11, and these are the preparation measures I've taken because of it. And now I feel safer and my family is safer.
And that's where it goes back to, if going back to 9/11, when I was in law enforcement at the time, and a year later or so, that's when the community emergency response teams started to come about, because the first responders to any disaster are the people that are right there. Those are the people that are the survivors that go to help other people, and and they do their own initial search and rescue and all that. And so I kind of look at it that way. That's what you got to kind of teach, the basics of. Just the other day, somebody was talking about, they asked me, do you have a tourniquet? And I go, yeah, I have one. It's in my car. I don't carry it with me all the time, but it's in my car. I know exactly where it's at. But, if you think about it, the vast majority of times, you might need a tourniquet pretty much anywhere you go nowadays.
Yeah, it's true.
So scary. All right, Hollie, is there a question I should have asked? If so, and how would you have answered it?
Okay, so it's a little bit off topic, but not. But I wish you would have asked me what my favorite story is. And the reason is because we're talking about storytelling and how they can impact people. And it's probably been said a million times in a million ways, but reading stories and hearing stories gives us perspectives on people that are different from us, situations that we wouldn't normally be in, but we can learn from. So my very favorite story, my favorite book that ever, I've read it multiple times.
Hollie, hold on one second. Hollie, what is your favorite story?
The Count of Monte Cristo.
Okay.
And the reason why is because I really am fascinated with the arc of the revenge character and why we root for them, right? Because here he is, he's had this big wrong. We can all see this happen to him. But some of the actions he takes while exacting his revenge aren't exactly moral or good. Sometimes we think of it as that vigilante justice, but we're still rooting for him. Like a Batman or a Green Arrow.
Yeah, the arch nemesis, yeah.
That's right, Because we've seen they're wrong and we want it to be righted. Even if some of the actions, they are in a gray area. And I love reading about those revenge characters.
Don't ever cross you, right, Hollie?
Yeah, exactly. I look nice, I swear.
All right, Hollie, anything else you want to add before we jump into rapid fire questions?
No, let's go.
All right, here we go. Texting or talking?
Talking.
Movies or books?
Books, obviously.
Coffee, tea, or energy drink?
Coffee, but I will close the night with like a nice honey chamomile sometimes.
Adult drink of choice?
A whiskey.
What's your favorite whiskey?
It actually doesn't matter, but we have this awesome distillery here where they age the bourbon in barrels, but they put them on the ocean, so the water turns them.
Oh.
And I just think that's really unique and fun.
That's interesting. Cool. What would be your superpower if you could have one?
This is my favorite because I've always wanted to be a spy. I would be able to speak any language of any country I went to. Just understand it and be able to speak it back.
Cool. Ask for permission or beg for forgiveness?
Ask for permission.
What place do you most want to travel to?
So recently, a lot of people across the country had the opportunity to see the Aurora Borealis or the Northern Lights, much farther south than they usually come. And we got to hear twice in Washington. on cloudless days, amazingly enough. And now I'm obsessed. So anywhere where I can see them, Finland, Norway, Svalbard, Alaska, I just want to chase the auroras.
Now, Iceland is supposed to be a phenomenal place to go see them too.
Yes, and they've got a volcano going right now.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah. What's your favorite way to relax after a long day?
It would be like going on a run, something for my body, or like a Zumba class. I was a dancer my whole life. Or reading like my National Geographic or favorite book. But honestly, as a parent of 3 kids, it's usually just like cooking dinner and finishing the laundry.
Yeah, I get that. I do that all the time.
Yeah.
What would you, if you could choose to have coffee with any historical figure, alive or dead, who would it be?
All the great writers. So Shakespeare and Mary Shelley and Jane Austen and Stephen King. I love him. He's such a prolific author. In fact, he wrote one of my favorite books, and today's a perfect day to talk about it, 11/22/63. Which is about a guy who travels back in time and becomes obsessed with stopping the Kennedy assassination, which is the day. And it's so good. And I would just love to sit down with him and talk to him. He's quirky and his mind works differently than most people.
I like that. That's an interesting. I'm going to have to get that book. I like that.
It's fantastic.
Awesome. Holly, final thoughts. What key points would you like the listeners to take from our interview today?
If you're not already using storytelling or not doing it as intentionally as you would like, I just encourage public information officers, anybody that does outreach and education, to use it and just see how it changes the way you talk to your public.
Awesome. As we wrap this up, is there a piece of wisdom or a motto that you live by?
Yeah, it's not really a motto, but I really just try to live by kindness. And I've been told before that it's not exactly a good leadership quality, in that it sometimes lends itself to letting people walk all over me. But I totally disagree. I will live my life by kindness, and how other people react to it is on them.
I don't agree that kindness is a weakness for a leader. I think kindness goes with compassion, and just being a compassionate person matters. And I think that that's highly important. And that goes to kindness as a leader for your people and taking care of your people. There's so many leaders that could care less about their staff, that, you know, they just abuse them and use them, and they don't care for the things that they need, or just the basics. You know, how are you doing? You know, instead of get this done tomorrow. Or, you know, I had a boss one year that Christmas Day called me. I need this report in 2 hours. What? It's Christmas Day. I'm going to a party. I'm not doing anything.
Yeah.
You know, that's not the kind of leader that you want. That's not compassion. That's not caring. You know, that's not what you want. So I don't agree with that. But
I agree with you. And like, as we go out in the public, sort of an unofficial edict of the things we do is this idea that everybody goes home, right? And if that is true, then we have to believe that as well. Everybody goes home. If you're different from me, if you're mean to me, if you want to take advantage, or if you just don't think the way I do, it doesn't matter. We are trying to save lives, and it's all lives.
Absolutely. How can people best reach you, Holly, if they want to connect or follow up or learn more about storytelling?
If you want to talk to me, you can reach me at my email, and I'll spell it out. So Hollie is HOLLIE .STARK. That's Stark as in Game of Thrones and or Tony. So Hollie.Stark at mil.wa.gov.
And I will add that into the show notes so people can find it. Holly, thank you very much for being on the show.
Oh, such a pleasure. It was so nice to meet you.
It was a pleasure meeting you too. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode and our content. If you are listening on a platform that allows reviews, please give us a review. We read all reviews, and your feedback is essential. Do not forget to check out our sponsor, Social News Desk. Thank you, Social News Desk, for their sponsorship and their offer to all our listeners. Please click the link at the bottom of today's show notes to help support the show. Your support in any amount is greatly appreciated. Until next time, Take care, stay curious, and keep the conversation going. You're the heart and soul of the PIO Podcast.